There are islands in the world where the birds don't fly away when you walk toward them. They simply stand there, unafraid. Because for millions of years, nothing hunted them. No land predators. No threats from the ground. Evolution never taught them to run. Then humans arrived. And they brought something with them. Something small. Something that hid in the hull of every ship that ever crossed the Pacific. The rat. Within decades, entire bird species that had survived for millions of years were gone. Not declining. Not threatened. Gone. New Zealand lost more native species to invasive rats than almost any other nation on Earth. Seabirds nesting in the ground. Ancient reptiles with no defenses. Insects the size of your hand, wiped out by an animal that arrived by accident. For a long time, no one knew how to stop it. Poison had limits. Trapping had limits. The islands were remote, rugged, and vast. And the rats kept winning. But then New Zealand decided to do something that had never been attempted at this scale anywhere in the world. They decided to erase them. Not control them. Not manage them. Erase them entirely from whole islands, permanently. What followed was one of the most ambitious, controversial, and consequential wildlife experiments in modern history. And what they discovered along the way changed everything scientists thought they knew about ecological restoration. To understand what New Zealand was up against, you have to understand the geography. New Zealand is not one island. It's thousands, scattered across the South Pacific, remote, windswept, some barely large enough to stand on, and almost every single one of them had been colonized by rats before scientists even began counting the damage. The Polynesian rat arrived first, over 1,000 years ago, carried by the earliest settlers. Then came the ship rat, the Norway rat, each wave more aggressive than the last. And these weren't ordinary infestations. Rats in island ecosystems behave differently than rats in cities. There are no natural predators, no competition, nothing keeping the population in check. So they breed without limit. A single breeding pair of rats can produce hundreds of descendants within 1 year. On a remote island, that number compounds into the tens of thousands. Scientists working in the field in the 1970s and 80s described walking through island forests at night and hearing them. Everywhere. In the canopy above, in the roots below, moving through the dark in numbers that felt less like wildlife and more like something systematic, something deliberate. The birds that nested on the ground, the petrels, the shearwaters, the ancient tuatara eggs buried in soil, had no chance. Researchers would return to monitored nests and find nothing. Not disturbed, not damaged, just empty, season after season. The rats weren't just eating. They were functionally preventing entire species from reproducing. And here was the part that stopped conservationists cold. Some of these bird species only bred once a year. One failed season wasn't a setback. It was a generational wound. By the 1980s, New Zealand's Department of Conservation had a problem they couldn't publicly ignore anymore. The extinction rate was accelerating, not slowing, not stabilizing, accelerating. Species that had survived the first wave of Polynesian settlement, survived the arrival of European ships, survived over 1,000 years of pressure, were now collapsing within single decades. The kakapo, the little spotted kiwi. Birds so ancient, so uniquely evolved that nothing else like them existed anywhere on Earth. And the primary driver in nearly every case was the same: rats. The early response was trapping. Thousands of traps laid across island terrain by teams of conservation workers moving through dense bush for weeks at a time. It made a dent, a small one. The rat populations would drop and then rebound within months, faster than the trapping could keep pace with. The islands were too large, too rugged, too remote for manual control to ever be a permanent solution. Then came poison operations. Brotifacum, a powerful anticoagulant rodenticide, was deployed across several smaller islands in the late 1980s, and something unexpected happened. It worked. On Breaksea Island in 1988, a full eradication was declared. The rats were gone, not reduced. Gone. It was the first time in recorded history that rats had been completely removed from a forested island of that size. Within 2 years, bird species that hadn't been heard on that island in decades began returning on their own. The forest literally came back to life. But the scientists standing in that recovered bush weren't just feeling relief. They were doing the math. Because Breaksea Island was small, and the islands that needed saving most were not. Breaksea Island was 170 hectares. Campbell Island, one of New Zealand's most ecologically critical sub-Antarctic islands, was 11,000. That's not a scaling problem. That's a different category of challenge entirely. Campbell Island sat alone in the Southern Ocean, battered by some of the most violent weather on the planet. Supply runs were difficult. Helicopter access was limited. The terrain was steep, saturated, and brutal, and it was absolutely overrun. Norway rats had arrived on Campbell Island with sealers and whalers in the early 1800s. 2 centuries of unchecked breeding had produced a population that scientists estimated in the millions. The island's gray-headed albatross, one of the largest seabirds on Earth, had been reduced to a single breeding colony. One, an animal with a wingspan of over 2 meters. A creature that could fly around the entire planet, reduced to clinging to existence on one small ridge of a remote island because rats were destroying every egg, every chick, every attempt at recovery. The question wasn't whether to attempt eradication. The question was whether it was even physically possible. The logistics alone were staggering. To cover 11,000 hectares of mountainous sub-Antarctic terrain with enough poison bait to kill every single rat, you couldn't do it on foot. You couldn't do it with ground teams. You needed aircraft. In 2001, New Zealand launched the largest island rodent eradication ever attempted at that time. Helicopters carrying GPS-guided bait spreaders flew systematic grid patterns across the entire island, in winter, in storms, in conditions that grounded flights for days at a time. The operation took months, and when it was over, no one was certain that it worked. Because with rats, certainty is never immediate. You wait, and you look for signs. The first sign came quietly. A field researcher on Campbell Island, months after the operation, reported something he hadn't heard in years. Birdsong, not distant, not faint. Close, layered, coming from multiple directions at once. The kind of sound that, according to the journals of the earliest European explorers, used to define these islands before the ships arrived. But the team held back from declaring success, because one rat, a single pregnant female, was enough to restart everything. One survivor could rebuild a population within 2 years, so they waited longer. Monitoring stations were checked. Tracking tunnels showed no activity. Bait stations remained untouched. Camera traps recorded nothing but wind and birds. 12 months passed. Then 18. Then, in 2003, Campbell Island was officially declared rat-free. It was a milestone that stunned the global conservation community. But what happened next was what no one had fully predicted. The albatross came back. Not slowly, not tentatively. They returned in numbers that overwhelmed the researchers stationed on the island. Breeding pairs established new colonies in areas that had been silent for generations. Chick survival rates, which had been catastrophically low for decades, suddenly normalized. The vegetation changed. The soil composition changed. Even the insect populations, crushed under the weight of rat predation for 2 centuries, began recovering. An entire ecosystem rebalancing itself, almost like it had been waiting. But here is where the story takes a turn that even the scientists didn't anticipate.
One down.
Because Campbell Island's success didn't just inspire the next operation. It revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the scale of what still remained. New Zealand had thousands of islands. And the mainland, home to 5 million people, had a rat problem that no helicopter grid pattern could ever fix. In 2016, New Zealand's government made an announcement that stopped ecologists worldwide. They called it Predator-Free 2050. The goal was exactly what it sounded like. By the year 2050, New Zealand intended to eliminate rats, stoats, and possums from the entire country, not islands. The entire country. 268,000 square kilometers of forests, mountains, coastlines, and cities. It was either the most ambitious conservation project in human history or the most expensive impossibility ever put to paper. Scientists were divided. Some called it visionary. Others called it fantasy dressed in government language. Because the mainland presented a problem the islands never had: re-invasion. On an island, once the rats are gone, you control the border. You inspect every boat, every supply crate, every piece of equipment that arrives. On a mainland, the rats are everywhere, permanently. Continuously breeding in every port, every farm, every urban edge. Eradication on that scale had never been attempted by any nation on Earth, and the tools available in 2016 weren't sufficient to do it. So New Zealand began funding something that made traditional conservationists deeply uncomfortable: genetic biocontrol research. The idea: engineering a genetic mechanism that could suppress rat reproduction across wild populations over generations. Effective, potentially permanent, and completely irreversible. The same nation that had shown the world how to restore an ecosystem was now standing at the edge of an entirely different kind of decision. One where the consequences, intended or not, could ripple far beyond any island, far beyond any border. This is what happens when a solution works so well. It demands a larger solution. And larger solutions carry larger risks. If this kind of story makes you think differently about the natural world, there's more where this came from. Subscribing means you won't miss what we cover next. In 2023, Australia made a decision that shocked conservationists around the world. They were going to kill 2 million cats. Not strays wandering city streets, not pets that had slipped through a fence. These were feral cats, wild, territorial, completely untouchable, spread across an area larger than Western Europe. And they were hunting every single night. Scientists estimated that Australia's feral cat population was consuming more than 1 billion native animals per year. Not hundreds of thousands, 1 billion. Entire species that had survived for millions of years, were disappearing faster than researchers could document them. The government had tried trapping. They had tried fencing. They had tried relocation. Nothing worked. So they turned to something far more extreme: aerial poisoning campaigns across the outback, shooting programs in regions so remote that supply helicopters couldn't always reach the hunters, and biological research that some scientists quietly called the most ethically complicated wildlife program in modern history. But the deeper they pushed into the problem, the more they realized something no government report had prepared them for. The cats weren't just surviving the eradication efforts. In some regions, they were thriving because of them. To understand why Australia declared war on its own wildlife, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the crisis. The beginning of the mistake. In the 1800s, European settlers arrived on a continent that had spent 60 million years evolving in near total isolation. The animals here had never seen a house cat. They had never needed to. Their instincts weren't built for it, and when domestic cats escaped, or were simply released, into the Australian bush, they didn't struggle to survive. They exploded, with no natural predators, no disease that could control their numbers, and an entire continent of prey that had no idea what was hunting them. Within decades, feral cats had pushed into every biome on the continent: desert, rainforest, coastal scrubland, alpine terrain, everywhere. By the late 20th century, researchers were finding cat territories stretching over 100 square kilometers per animal. A single cat, 100 square kilometers of hunting ground. And unlike lions or wolves, animals that kill when hungry, feral cats kill continuously. It's not survival behavior. It's instinct they cannot switch off. Small mammals, ground-nesting birds, reptiles that took millions of years to evolve, gone in a single night's hunt. Scientists began calling it the silent extinction. Because there were no carcasses left behind, no visible destruction, just absence. Species that were present one season and simply weren't the next. By the time the government acknowledged the true scale of the problem, the cats had already won the first war. The first official eradication programs began quietly. No press conferences, no public announcements, just rangers, traps, and a problem the government wasn't ready to admit was already out of control. They started with cage trapping, humanely capturing feral cats in remote zones and euthanizing them on site. It seemed logical. It was a disaster. Feral cats, unlike their domestic cousins, are extraordinarily trap-shy. They learn, they observe. Rangers reported setting hundreds of traps across vast stretches of outback and returning days later to find them untouched. Not sprung, not avoided by accident, deliberately ignored. One researcher described watching a feral cat approach a baited trap, circle it 3 times, and walk away without ever breaking stride. These weren't domesticated animals that had gone wild. They were something else entirely. Generations removed from human contact, hardwired for suspicion, so the government escalated. They introduced poison baiting programs, specially designed sausages laced with a compound called 1080, dropped from low-flying aircraft across remote conservation zones. In some areas, cat numbers dropped, temporarily, because what no one had fully accounted for was how quickly the remaining cats reproduced. A single feral female can produce 3 litters per year, up to 6 kittens per litter. Remove 60% of a local population, and within 18 months the numbers have recovered, sometimes higher than before. The land was vast. The cats were faster than any program designed to stop them. And somewhere in the remote northwest, researchers were beginning to find something in their data that didn't make sense. Something that suggested the problem had a second layer entirely. The data was coming from a research station in Western Australia. A small team of wildlife ecologists had been GPS tracking feral cats across a 2,000 square kilometer study zone. What they found stopped the project lead cold. In areas where baiting had been most intensive, cat movement patterns had changed. The surviving animals weren't retreating. They were reorganizing. Cats that had previously maintained solitary territories, animals that by nature avoid each other, were now being detected in overlapping zones, moving in loose, coordinated patterns, following the same corridors at the same times of night. The researchers were careful not to overstate it. These weren't packs. Cats don't form packs. But something in the pressure of the eradication campaign had pushed their behavior into territory that no field manual had documented before. And then came the second discovery. The native prey species that the baiting program had been designed to protect were also consuming the poison bait. Bilbies, bandicoots, species already critically endangered, found dead in zones that were supposed to be recovery areas. The program designed to save them was killing them. Conservation groups went public. Farmers in the Northern Territory pushed back against aerial campaigns crossing their land. And within the scientific community, a quiet but bitter argument broke out. Some researchers argued the entire eradication strategy was fundamentally flawed. That you couldn't poison your way out of an ecological crisis this size. That Australia needed something different. Something that had never been attempted at this scale anywhere in the world. What they were proposing made the baiting program look cautious by comparison. The proposal had a name: biodiversity fencing. The idea was radical in its simplicity. Take a massive section of Australian wilderness, surround it with a predator-proof fence, a structure stretching dozens of kilometers, buried underground, angled outward at the top. Eliminate every feral cat inside the boundary, then reintroduce native species into a protected zone where they could recover without predation pressure. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it became something else entirely. The first large-scale sanctuary fences were erected in South Australia. Teams of hunters swept the interiors on foot, by vehicle, by drone. Weeks of systematic clearance operations, and when they were confident the zones were clean, they released populations of bilbies, betongs, and numats, animals that hadn't been seen in those regions for decades. For a few months, The data looked extraordinary. Native species numbers climbing, breeding activity recorded. Researchers describing it as a genuine ecological resurrection. Then a ranger doing a routine perimeter check found something that shouldn't have been there.
Look at the size.
Tracks, cat tracks, inside the fence. They pulled the surveillance footage from motion-activated cameras positioned along the boundary, and there it was. A single feral cat, lean, unhurried, scaling the fence in under 4 seconds, not finding a gap, not slipping through a weakness in the structure, climbing it. The fence that had cost millions to construct. The fence that was supposed to be the solution. And if one cat had made it inside, the rangers knew they had no way of knowing how many others already had. The recovery zone had been compromised, and the native animals inside it had nowhere left to run. They found 3 more cats inside the fence within a week, 3 that they could confirm. The native animal numbers, the ones that had been climbing, began to drop. Quietly, steadily, the same pattern researchers had documented across the open outback, now happening inside the one place that was supposed to be different. Emergency hunting teams were deployed inside the sanctuary zone, but hunting cats in dense scrubland at night in an area now also populated with the rare animals you're trying to protect is not a precise operation. 2 betongs were accidentally killed during clearance sweeps. The situation was becoming what one senior ecologist privately described as a controlled failure. Publicly, the program continued. More fences were planned. More funding was allocated. But inside the research community, something had shifted. Because the data from a decade of eradication efforts was now telling a story that no government agency had been prepared to hear. Australia had spent hundreds of millions of dollars, had deployed hunters, aircraft, poison, fencing, drones, and some of the most advanced wildlife tracking technology on Earth. And the feral cat population was roughly the same size it had been when the programs began. Not defeated, not reduced in any meaningful long-term way. Simply redistributed, pushed into different zones, adapted to different pressures. Continuing, the outback is 4 times the size of Texas. And somewhere out there tonight, an animal that was never supposed to be wild is hunting. As it has every night for 200 years, and likely will, long after the last program designed to stop it has been quietly shut down.